It was one of those evenings that felt like it was going to be just another ordinary night. The kind where you wrap yourself up in a blanket, pour a glass of wine, and let Netflix drown out the sound of silence. I had been living alone for almost a year now, in this small, two-story house on the outskirts of town. It was peaceful, quiet, and for the most part, I liked that. I liked my solitude. That night, a thick fog hung over the neighborhood, giving everything an eerie, ghostly quality. The trees seemed to sway in slow motion, and the occasional gust of wind rattled the windows. It wasn't particularly cold, but the dampness in the air sent shivers down my spine. I remember looking out the window, trying to see past the fog, but it was like staring into a wall of nothingness. Around 9 p.m., the power went out. It wasn't unusual. The grid here wasn't the most reliable, and outages happened occasionally, especially on nights like this. I sighed, grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and made my way to the living room, cursing under my breath about the timing. I had just started a new series, something thrilling, and now I was stuck in the dark. With no lights, no TV, and no internet, I figured I'd take the opportunity to check the windows. The weather was worsening, and the wind was picking up. The old house had a way of letting in drafts, and I didn't want to wake up to a freezing home. As I moved from room to room, locking windows, I felt a strange sensation in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't anything concrete, just an odd feeling, like I wasn't entirely alone. But I dismissed it quickly. I've always had an overactive imagination, and living alone meant I had to learn to deal with moments like these. I was used to the creaks of the house, the occasional tap of branches on the windows, and the way shadows seemed to move when you least expected it. But that night something felt different. I reached the last window in the kitchen. It was partially open, and I cursed at myself for not noticing earlier. The wind had picked up so much that the curtains were fluttering like someone had just passed by. I fumbled with the latch, trying to close it, when I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a figure, moving quickly past the side of the house. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my hands still on the window. I stood there for what felt like minutes, but it was probably only seconds, waiting for any other sign of movement. Maybe it was a neighbor, I told myself. Or a deer. God, I hoped it was just a deer. But my mind was already racing, picturing the worst possible scenarios. I was alone, in a house with no power, and someone, or something, was outside. My phone was on the kitchen counter. I grabbed it, ready to call the police. But as I unlocked the screen, I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no service. The signal must have been knocked out along with the power. I swore under my breath. Of course, this had to happen on a night like tonight. For a moment, I considered grabbing my car keys and making a run for it. But where would I go? The nearest town was miles away, and driving through the fog was a death wish. Plus, if it really was just an animal, I'd feel like an idiot. Still, the feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. I decided to check the front door, make sure it was locked. As I passed through the hallway, I kept the flashlight beam steady, scanning every corner. The house was dead silent, save for the occasional groan of the wind. I reached the door and tested the lock. Secure. That's when I heard it. A soft thud, like something, or someone, had knocked into something outside. My heart raced, my palms sweating as I slowly backed away from the door. I told myself to stay calm, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the dread creeping up my spine. I thought of calling a neighbor, but then I remembered, no service. I tried turning off my phone, hoping it would reconnect, but no luck. I was cut off, completely isolated. I needed to stay calm. I thought about heading upstairs, maybe waiting it out in my bedroom until the power came back. But then, as I turned to head for the stairs, a loud crash came from the back of the house, the sound of glass shattering. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had broken in. Without thinking, I bolted toward the basement door. The basement was my only option. It had no windows, only a heavy wooden door that I could lock behind me. I could hide there until the morning, until the power returned, or until I figured out what to do. The flashlight shook in my hand as I threw open the basement door and hurried down the steps. I closed the door behind me, locking it with trembling fingers. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Down here, the air was colder, the concrete walls trapping the dampness of the earth around me. The only sound was my own breathing. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I should have called the police the moment I saw that figure, but now it was too late. Whoever was in my house, if it was a person, was inside. I was trapped in the basement, with no way to contact anyone. That's when I remembered something. My car. I had left it in the garage, just outside the basement door. I had a spare phone charger in there. If I could make it to the car, charge my phone, and call for help, I might still get out of this. I moved quietly, creeping toward the small door that led to the garage. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I turned it and stepped into the garage, the cold air immediately biting at my skin. The flashlight beam bounced off the dark shapes of the tools hanging on the wall, the old bikes, and the clutter that had accumulated over the months. I approached the car, fumbling for my keys. As I reached for the driver's side door, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. A face. Staring back at me. I froze, my blood running cold as the realization hit me. I wasn't alone. The face in the rearview mirror was pale and gaunt, a stark contrast against the shadows of the garage. I could hardly make out the details. The dim light from my flashlight flickered ominously, and all I could see was a pair of wide, empty eyes fixated on me, unblinking. I stumbled back, the flashlight nearly slipping from my grasp as I fought to comprehend what I was seeing. My heart pounded violently in my chest, the sound echoing in my ears like a drum. The stranger's face seemed to shift in the dark, melting into the shadows before my eyes. I blinked, hoping that when I opened them again, it would vanish. But it didn't. I could feel my breath quickening as a primal instinct kicked in. Run. I turned on my heel and sprinted back to the basement door, fumbling with the knob as panic threatened to overwhelm me. My fingers were slick with sweat, and it took every ounce of focus I had to turn the lock. Finally, I slammed the door shut, pushing my back against it as if I could somehow keep whatever was outside from getting in. In the dark, I pressed my ear to the door, listening intently. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding in rhythm with the stillness surrounding me. But there was something else, an unsettling sound, faint but growing louder, like soft footsteps creeping closer. "Please, no," I whispered to myself, tears stinging my eyes. I was too terrified to cry, but the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on my chest. The figure had to have come from the house. Maybe they hadn't seen me yet. Maybe if I stayed quiet, I could slip away once things calmed down. I didn't know how long I stood there, holding my breath, but eventually the footsteps stopped. Silence enveloped the basement, a heavy, suffocating silence. I cautiously edged away from the door, moving deeper into the shadows where the light didn't reach. My flashlight flickered ominously, its battery waning, and I cursed under my breath. I needed to think. I couldn't let panic take over. The stranger was still in my house, and I was trapped down here. There had to be a way out. As I groped around the basement, my foot hit something solid, a toolbox. I knelt down, fingers brushing across the surface until I found the latch. Flipping it open, I quickly rummaged through it, finding a hammer and some old screwdrivers. My heart raced. I wasn't sure if I was going to need them for self-defense, or if I would find a way to escape through a window. Then, just as I was about to take a step back toward the stairs, I heard it. A loud crash echoed from the upstairs, a heavy thud followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. The intruder was tearing through my house, searching for me. My gut twisted at the thought. What if they found me here? My heart raced, and a sudden surge of adrenaline fueled me as I scrambled back toward the basement door. I needed to act fast. I couldn't stay trapped like a sitting duck. With the hammer clutched tightly in my hand, I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I was going to have to confront whatever was out there. It was time to take back control. I turned the knob and opened the basement door just a crack, peering into the dim light of the hallway above. Everything was silent again. I couldn't hear anything, no footsteps, no signs of life. I pushed the door open a little wider, straining to see if there was any movement. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" The stillness was unsettling, and the darkness beyond felt thick and oppressive. My instincts screamed at me to retreat, but I had to know. I had to see if the stranger was still in the house or if I had a chance to escape. I stepped out into the hallway, my flashlight casting an uneven beam across the walls. I could feel a chill creeping through the air, a sense of foreboding that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I moved cautiously, each step echoing in the silence. As I reached the top of the stairs, I caught sight of the living room through the archway. My heart dropped. The furniture was overturned, and the coffee table lay shattered on the floor. The curtains fluttered wildly, and the window was wide open, flapping in the wind. Had the intruder left? Or had they found another way into my home? My stomach twisted with dread, and I debated whether to retreat back to the safety of the basement or push forward into the chaos of my once peaceful living space. A flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned sharply, shining the flashlight toward the open window. The wind whistled through the gap, but there was something else, a figure just beyond the edge of the light. I instinctively stepped back, but it was too late. The figure moved swiftly, appearing in the doorway, their silhouette framed by the faint light from the street lamp outside. My breath hitched in my throat as I raised the hammer, ready to defend myself. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice quaking but filled with a determination I didn't know I had. The figure paused, and for a moment, there was silence. Then they stepped into the light, revealing a woman, wild-eyed and disheveled. I lowered the hammer slightly, my mind racing to process the sight. "Please," she said, her voice shaky and desperate. "You have to help me." "Help you? Why are you in my house?" I demanded, confusion swirling in my mind. "There's someone chasing me," she said, her eyes darting around the room, as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. "I saw him coming after me, and I thought I could hide here. But I didn't mean to scare you." My instincts kicked in. I looked past her, scanning the dark hallway. "Where is he now? Did you see him?" "No, but he was right behind me. I thought he was going to." Her voice broke, and she pressed a trembling hand against her forehead. "I thought he was going to kill me." I felt a surge of empathy mixed with fear. This woman was just as terrified as I was, but it didn't mean we were safe. "We need to call the police," I said, glancing at my phone again, but it still showed no signal. "Are you serious?" she gasped. "We can't stay here. He could be here any moment. We need to get out, now." Her frantic energy ignited a spark of urgency in me. I knew I had to make a decision, and I had to make it fast. "Okay, let's go," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We moved toward the door, but just as I stepped out into the front yard, I heard a noise, heavy footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart dropped, and I looked back at the woman, panic in her eyes. "Hide!" I hissed, pushing her back into the shadows of the house. I could see a figure approaching in the dim light, a man with a hood pulled low over his face, moving with a deliberate purpose toward the house. I pressed my back against the wall, hammer gripped tightly in my hand, ready to confront whatever was coming. My mind raced with the possibilities. What if he was armed? What if I didn't stand a chance? The man paused outside the door, peering through the broken glass of the window, scanning the interior. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest, and I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't see us. He stepped closer, reaching for the doorknob, and that's when it hit me. I had to do something. I had to protect myself and this woman who had stumbled into my nightmare. In one swift motion, I raised the hammer and prepared to swing it if he came inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and I prepared for the worst. The door swung open with a heavy creak, and the man stepped inside, his form dark and foreboding against the dim light of the hallway. He was taller than I expected, with broad shoulders and an imposing presence that sent chills down my spine. I gripped the hammer tighter, my knuckles turning white as I steadied my breath. He paused, surveying the room. "I know you're in here," he shouted, his voice low and threatening. "You can't hide from me. I'll find you." The adrenaline coursed through my veins, and I felt a surge of defiance rise up within me. I was not going to let him intimidate me. He might have thought he was in control, but I wasn't just going to stand by and let him have his way. "Get out!" I yelled, trying to sound brave even though my heart was racing. The woman beside me trembled, her eyes wide with fear. I could see the uncertainty in her face, and I knew we needed to act. The man stepped further into the living room, oblivious to our presence in the shadows. "You think you can just run away?" he taunted, moving closer to the overturned furniture. "You think I'm going to let you get away after what you did? What are you talking about?" I shouted back, trying to distract him, to buy us some time. "Who are you? What do you want?" His gaze snapped toward me, and a sinister smile spread across his face. "I want what you took from me," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "And I won't stop until I get it." I glanced at the woman, and her eyes mirrored my confusion. "What did we take?" I whispered urgently. Before she could respond, the man took another step forward, his eyes glinting with menace. "You're going to pay for this," he shouted, lunging toward the nearest piece of furniture. I knew we couldn't just stand there. With a burst of adrenaline, I stepped out from the shadows, brandishing the hammer in front of me. "Get away from us!" I shouted, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. He hesitated for a moment, surprised by my sudden boldness. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he weighed his options. But that moment of hesitation was all I needed. With a swift motion, I swung the hammer toward him, aiming for his knee. It connected with a loud thud, and he howled in pain, stumbling back. The woman gasped, and for a moment, I thought we had the upper hand. But he was relentless. He recovered quickly, anger flashing in his eyes. "You think you can stop me?" he roared, charging at me with a frightening speed. I barely had time to react as I sidestepped, narrowly avoiding his outstretched hand. The hammer slipped from my grip, clattering to the floor as I tried to put some distance between us. I needed a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. The woman was frozen in place, her face pale and terrified. "Run!" I screamed at her, but she seemed paralyzed by fear. In a split second, I spotted the kitchen knife on the counter. I dashed toward it, adrenaline surging through my body. I grabbed the knife just as the man turned to face me again, fury radiating from him. "You think that's going to save you?" he sneered, advancing toward me. "You're just a scared little girl. I'm not scared of you." I shot back, trying to sound braver than I felt. I brandished the knife, holding it out in front of me. "Stay back!" He laughed, a low, menacing sound that made my skin crawl. "You really think you can stop me with that?" In that moment, something inside me snapped. I was done being afraid. I had already survived too much tonight to back down now. "You don't scare me!" I shouted, the knife steady in my hand. He lunged again, but this time, I was ready. I swung the knife, aiming for his arm. It grazed his skin, leaving a shallow cut, but it was enough to startle him. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock. "Get out!" I yelled again, taking a step toward him, emboldened by the small victory. "You're not welcome here!" He glanced between the door and me, realizing that he was no match for a cornered animal. In that instant of hesitation, I seized my chance and charged forward, ready to push him out the door. But just as I reached him, the woman finally sprang into action. With a burst of energy, she tackled him from the side, and together, we forced him back toward the door. He stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but we were relentless. "Get out!" We screamed in unison, our voices a powerful chorus as we shoved him out into the night. The cold air rushed in, and with one final push, he stumbled backward and crashed to the ground. I slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. I leaned against it, panting, my heart racing as I turned to face the woman. "Are you okay?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We both almost did," I said, trying to catch my breath. "But we did it. We fought him off." We stood in the dim light of the living room, still reeling from what had just happened. I glanced at the shattered glass, the chaos of the room, and the palpable fear that still hung in the air. But in that moment, something shifted. I felt a spark of resilience igniting within me. I was still alive. We were still alive. I reached for my phone, still with no signal, but I wouldn't let that defeat me. I would find a way to make it through the night. Together, we would call for help and take back our power. As I looked back at the woman, I realized we had both faced our fears and come out on the other side. "We need to figure out what to do next," I said, my voice steady. And as the fog curled around the house, shrouding the chaos in its eerie embrace, we stood together, ready to face whatever came next. I don't know if it was the alcohol clouding my thoughts or the strange silence of the streets that night, but something didn't feel right. I had just gotten back from a bar a couple of blocks away. It wasn't a wild night, just a few beers with some friends from work. Chicago had a chill in the air. October was always like that, teasing winter, but the feeling in my gut wasn't because of the cold. It was something else, something darker that I couldn't shake off. I pushed the door to our building open and walked through the dimly lit hallway. The old place we rented had this peculiar creaking sound, as if it was complaining about every step you took. I lived there with Mike and Eric. We had been roommates for about a year, sharing rent in this old, slightly rundown apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was cheap, and in Chicago, that meant something. Mike was the kind of guy who always had his own thing going on. He worked odd jobs and, well, dealt some stuff on the side. Mostly weed, nothing too serious. He was always careful about who he let into our place, or so I thought. As I got closer to our apartment, I heard a faint knock on the door. It was odd because it was late, and we never really had visitors at this hour. My first thought was that maybe it was Mike's latest client, looking to score something. The knock came again, a bit more insistent this time. I unlocked the door, feeling the handle stick a little like it always did. As the door swung open, I was greeted by someone I didn't expect, a girl, mid-20s, standing in the dim hallway. Her hair was long and tangled, and her eyes had this strange intensity, like she hadn't slept in days. She was pale, wearing a thin coat that seemed too light for the chill outside. "Hey, I'm looking for Mike," she said, her voice soft but shaky. I hesitated for a moment, squinting at her. I'd never seen her before. Mike had girls over sometimes, but he usually gave us a heads up if someone was coming over late. This felt off, but the way she said his name, it was familiar, like she knew him, maybe even close to him. "Yeah, Mike's upstairs," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. "You can go up." But she didn't move. She just stood there, looking past me into a hallway like she was waiting for something or someone. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Maybe she was just nervous. "Are you okay?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, her expression changed. It was subtle, but there was something in her eyes, fear maybe? Or was it guilt? Before I could say anything else, there was a loud thud at the entrance of the building, like something heavy had slammed into the front door. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was empty, but I could hear footsteps, slow and heavy, approaching the stairs. The girl didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I closed the door behind her, more out of instinct than anything else, and started heading up the stairs to the second floor where Mike's room was. I expected her to follow, but when I looked back, she was gone. I stopped midway up the stairs, confusion flooding my mind. Had she left? Did she slip out without me noticing? It didn't make sense. I hadn't even heard the door open. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the alcohol wearing off, replaced by a sharp clarity that only comes when adrenaline hits. I reached the top of the stairs and called out, "Mike? Mike, you awake?" No response. The whole house felt eerily quiet. My breathing became shallow as I slowly made my way to his room. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open gently, half expecting to find Mike asleep or maybe with headphones on, oblivious to the weirdness happening downstairs. But Mike wasn't there. His room was empty. A wave of unease hit me. Something was definitely off. My mind raced back to the girl. Where the hell had she gone? And who, or what, had made that noise downstairs? I turned back towards the stairs, but before I could take a step, I heard it again. That same heavy thud, followed by footsteps, only this time they were coming up the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest as the sound got louder and closer. For a brief, panicked moment, I considered calling the cops. But something told me that this wasn't something the cops could help with, not yet, anyway. I glanced around for something to defend myself with, and the only thing I could find was an old baseball bat Mike kept in the corner of his room. I grabbed it, my hands trembling. The footsteps stopped. I could feel someone, or something, just beyond the landing of the stairs. I took a step forward, bat in hand, ready to swing if I had to. The silence was unbearable. And then I saw him. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing at the foot of the stairs. He was dressed in all black, his face hidden in the shadows, but I could see the gleam of something in his hand, a long, heavy metal pipe. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of fear than aggression. "What the hell do you want?" He didn't answer. He just took another step up the stairs, slowly and deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. The girl's face flashed in my mind, her pale skin, the haunted look in her eyes. This wasn't some random break-in. This was planned, and I had let her in. I backed into Mike's room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me just as the man's heavy footsteps reached the top of the stairs. My heart raced as I pressed my back against the door, holding my breath, trying to listen for any sound from the other side. The doorknob rattled. "Mike?" I whispered, hoping, praying, that he was somewhere in the house, that this was all some twisted misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew better. Whoever this man was, he wasn't here for Mike. He was here for me. I stood there, frozen, with my back pressed hard against the door, trying to steady my breath. The rattling of the doorknob had stopped, but I knew that whoever was out there hadn't left. I could feel his presence on the other side, waiting. The only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears like a war drum. What the hell was happening? I racked my brain for answers. The girl, the strange girl, had come looking for Mike. But she didn't seem right. She wasn't scared when that guy showed up. If anything, she looked like she knew him, like she was part of whatever this was. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but they painted a picture that I didn't want to accept. It wasn't about Mike. It was never about him. I had been the one they were targeting. But why? I reached for my phone in my pocket, the cold metal of it grounding me for a second. My fingers fumbled as I unlocked it and pulled up Mike's number. I dialed, my hands shaking, hoping to God he was somewhere nearby, or at least safe. It rang once, twice, and then his voicemail kicked in. Shit, I cursed under my breath, pacing back and forth in his room like a caged animal. Mike was either out, or worse, he was already caught up in whatever this nightmare was. Then I remembered something. Eric, our other roommate. Eric was the quiet one, always keeping to himself, but he'd know what to do. I quickly dialed his number, my fingers trembling as I pressed each button. It rang, but this time, after what felt like an eternity, Eric picked up. "Yo, what's up, man?" Eric's voice sounded groggy, like he had just woken up. "Dude, something's wrong," I said, my voice cracking from fear. "There's this guy, he's in the house. He's got a pipe or something, and there was this girl, she asked for Mike, but she didn't come up, and now the guy's trying to get in Mike's room." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and I could almost hear Eric processing what I just said. "What the fuck? Where are you?" Eric asked, his voice more alert now. "I'm in Mike's room. I locked the door, but the guy's out there. I don't know what to do. I think they're after me." Eric was silent again, and I could hear him moving around, likely getting dressed or grabbing something. "Stay put. I'm coming up." I sighed in relief, my grip on the phone tightening. Eric was the calm, collected one. He didn't deal with the chaos that Mike and I often found ourselves in. Maybe, just maybe, he'd have some idea of what to do. But just as I felt a flicker of hope, a loud bang echoed through the apartment. My stomach dropped as I realized it was the sound of the front door slamming shut. Someone had left. I crept toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to get a view of the street. The night was still eerily quiet, but then I saw it, Eric, running out of the building. For a split second, I didn't understand. Eric was leaving? My mind couldn't process it. He had just told me he was coming up, that he was going to help. But there he was, disappearing into the night without a second glance. Had he abandoned me? Panic surged through my veins again. I was alone. Completely alone. The footsteps outside the door started again, slow and deliberate. Whoever was on the other side hadn't gone after Eric. No, he was still here, focused on me. I clutched the baseball bat tighter in my hands, my palms sweaty and my muscles tensed. There was a sudden, loud bang on the door. Then another, harder this time, like he was testing its strength. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. If that door gave way, I didn't stand a chance against him. I wasn't strong enough to fight off a guy that size, and even if I was, the metal pipe he carried would end things before I could even try. I took a step back, frantically scanning Mike's room for something, anything, that might help me. My eyes landed on the window. We were on the second floor, which wasn't too high. If I could get out through there, I could maybe make a run for it. But as I looked outside, my heart sank. Standing in the alley below, in the shadow of the building, was the girl. She was just standing there, looking up at the window, her pale face almost glowing in the dim light of the street lamp. She was waiting. For me. I backed away from the window, my chest tightening. They had me cornered. No matter which way I tried to escape, they had planned for it. The girl was the bait, and the man was the hunter. And Eric. I didn't know what his role was in this twisted game, but he was gone, and that left me with nothing. I had no choice but to confront whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of that door. The banging grew louder, more violent, as if the man had grown impatient. The door rattled in its frame, and I could see the wood starting to splinter around the lock. "Think, damn it, think!" I muttered to myself, trying to force my brain to work through the panic. Then, in a flash of desperation, I remembered something. Mike kept his stash hidden in the closet, not just drugs, but other things too, things he used for protection. I rushed to the closet, flinging the door open and shoving aside boxes and clothes until I found it. A small metal lockbox. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the key Mike had stupidly left taped under the dresser. I jammed it into the lock and twisted it open, revealing a small handgun. I'd never fired a gun in my life, but I didn't have time to think about that. I grabbed it, flicking off the safety just like I'd seen in movies. My breath was coming in short, ragged bursts now as the doors shook with each violent hit. The man was nearly through. I stood in the middle of the room, gun in one hand, baseball bat in the other, heart racing like it was trying to break free from my chest. The final blow came, and the door burst open with a deafening crack. The man stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, his face still hidden in the shadows. He was even bigger up close, his shoulders practically filling the frame. The metal pipe glinted in the dim light, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. But he didn't answer. He just took a step forward, raising the pipe, ready to strike. Without thinking, I raised the gun and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the small room. The man stopped, staggered for a moment, and then collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The gun was still in my hand, smoke rising from the barrel. I had shot him. I had actually shot him. But before I could process anything else, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. Footsteps. Coming up the stairs. There was more than one. The footsteps were heavier now, faster, and there were more than just one set. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I stood there, gun still raised, my finger hovering over the trigger like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The man I'd shot lay motionless on the floor in front of me, but I didn't feel relief. No, this wasn't over. I backed away from the body, stepping around it, my foot slipping on the blood slowly pooling beneath him. The metallic smell hit me hard, making my stomach churn. The weight of what I'd just done pressed down on me, suffocating me, but I didn't have time to think about it. The sound of the footsteps on the stairs was growing louder, closer, and my body moved on pure instinct. I stumbled toward the door, stepping into a hallway just as the first shadow appeared at the top of the staircase. There were two of them. One was a woman, tall, with sharp features, her dark hair pulled tightly back. Her eyes locked onto mine the moment she saw me, and the corners of her mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was more like she was amused. Like she knew exactly what was going to happen, and it was all just part of the plan. Behind her, another man loomed, just as tall as the one I'd shot, maybe taller. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could see the glint of something in his hand, another pipe, or maybe a crowbar. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins, drowning out every rational thought. I could barely think, barely breathe. I turned and ran, knowing that staying here meant certain death. I didn't even know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away from them as possible. I bolted down the hallway, past Eric's empty room, past the bathroom, my feet slapping against the wooden floors. Behind me, I could hear them coming, their footsteps steady, unhurried. Like they knew I had nowhere to go. Mike's room, the room where I had just killed a man, was no longer an option. I had to think fast. My room was at the end of the hall, but it wasn't safe. There was no way out from there, just a small window that led to nothing but the alley 2 stories below. And that's when it hit me. The fire escape. I'd always hated that rusty old thing. It was barely functional, creaking loudly every time someone tried to use it. But now, it was my only hope. I reached my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it in one swift motion. The gun still felt heavy in my hand, but I couldn't waste time thinking about it. I raced to the window, throwing it open. The cold night air hit my face like a slap, sharp and biting. Below me, the fire escape stretched down into the alley, its rickety metal railings barely visible in the dim streetlight. Behind me, I could hear them banging on the door, testing the handle. They were coming. I climbed out onto the fire escape, my hands gripping the freezing metal, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't have time to worry about how unstable it looked, or how far down I'd have to go. I just had to move. I made it down the first set of stairs, the metal groaning under my weight. Every step sent a screech echoing through the quiet alley, and I knew they could hear it. I was halfway down when I looked up, and saw her. The girl. The same girl who had knocked on our door, asking for Mike. She was standing at the bottom of the fire escape, just staring up at me, her face expressionless. My blood ran cold. She hadn't moved since I'd last seen her. It was as if she had been standing there, waiting for me to come to her. The girl wasn't an accomplice, wasn't some random visitor looking for Mike. She was part of this. All of this. I froze, unsure of what to do next. If I kept going down, I'd be walking straight into her. But if I stayed, I was trapped between her and whoever was still trying to get into my room. There was no time to think, no time to plan. The sound of wood splintering above told me that the door had finally given way. "Fuck," I muttered, looking back up toward the apartment. I couldn't go back, but I couldn't go forward either. I was stuck. I looked down again, and the girl's lips parted into a slow, eerie smile. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, the words coming out more desperate than I intended. She didn't answer. She just took a step closer to the fire escape, blocking my path. I raised the gun, my hands shaking. I wasn't sure if I could shoot her, if I even should shoot her. The man upstairs, I had shot him because he was going to kill me. But this girl, she hadn't made a move to hurt me. Not yet anyway. "Stay back," I warned, my voice cracking. I was losing it. Panic had taken hold completely now, my rational thoughts crumbling under the weight of fear. She tilted her head slightly, as if amused by my threat, and then, in one swift motion, she grabbed the bottom of the fire escape ladder and pulled. The whole structure jolted, metal screeching as the ladder shifted beneath me. I lost my balance and grabbed onto the railing, the gun slipping from my hand and clattering down onto the pavement below. I was hanging there, half off the ladder, dangling above the alley with no way to defend myself. The girl looked up at me, her smile widening. "You were never meant to survive this," she said, her voice calm, almost soothing. "This was always going to be his fate." Her words chilled me to my core, but before I could respond, something else happened. A loud bang echoed from above, another gunshot, but this time not from me. I looked up, and to my disbelief, Mike stood at the top of the fire escape, holding a gun of his own. He looked battered, his face bloodied and bruised, but he was alive. He must have heard the commotion, or maybe he had been hiding somewhere nearby the entire time, waiting for the right moment. The girl's expression faltered, and she took a step back, her eyes narrowing. Mike didn't hesitate. He fired again, and this time, the bullet found its mark. The girl crumpled to the ground, her body hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. I couldn't believe it. It was over. But then Mike looked down at me, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Get down here, now!" he shouted, his voice raw and urgent. I scrambled down the rest of the fire escape, my legs shaking as I dropped to the ground. Mike grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the street, away from the alley, away from the nightmare that had consumed the last hour of my life. As we stumbled down the dark street, sirens blaring in the distance, I finally let myself breathe. "Mike, what the hell was that? Who were they?" He shook his head, still in shock. "I don't know, man. I don't know. But they weren't after me. They were after you." We kept running, disappearing into the night, leaving behind the dead girl, the blood, and the broken pieces of whatever life we had before. But as we turned the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. That somewhere, in the shadows, someone was still watching, waiting, and I had a sinking feeling they'd be back. I was only 8 years old at the time, but I remember that night vividly. It was one of those nights that never quite fades from memory, the kind where your stomach knots at the thought of it, and you find yourself questioning if it even really happened, or if it was just some distorted nightmare. But it was real. All of it. Our home was small, a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of a quiet, rundown town in upstate New York. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. My mom worked long hours at the diner, trying to make ends meet for me, my younger brother, Alex, and my grandmother, Lorraine, who had moved in with us after my dad left. The cracks in our family ran deep, even back then. I think that's why no one ever thought too much of the strange occurrences that started happening in that house. The first few months after we moved in, we would hear things, footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, strange tapping noises on the walls, or doors that would creak open on their own. My mom always dismissed it as the house settling, or the wind playing tricks. Even though it was unsettling, it became almost routine. We didn't question it, didn't talk about it, we just accepted it. It was a Friday night. I remember because it was my turn to stay up late with Grandma. Every Friday night she would watch her favorite TV shows, and I would curl up on the couch next to her, half asleep but trying to stay awake as long as possible. My brother Alex, only 5 at the time, had already gone to bed hours earlier. The house was unusually quiet, except for the muffled sounds of the TV. The shadows danced on the walls, the dim lighting casting long, eerie shapes that seemed to shift as I blinked my eyes. Grandma Lorraine was sitting in her usual spot in the armchair, eyes fixed on the TV screen, her short silver hair catching the light in the room. She had a tough exterior, always the rock in our family, especially after my dad left. She wasn't one to scare easily, which is why what happened next still gives me chills to this day. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard it. A strange noise coming from the hallway, faint at first, like someone shuffling their feet slowly, cautiously. I thought it might have been Alex, maybe he had woken up from a bad dream. But then I heard something else, whispers, low and urgent, but unintelligible. I remember sitting up on the couch, straining to hear more clearly. My heart started pounding in my chest, and a strange sense of dread settled over me, like I knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite place it. I glanced over at Grandma, but she didn't seem to notice. She was still glued to her show, oblivious to the sounds coming from the hallway. The shuffling continued, and then the whispering grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't Alex. I knew that now. I didn't know who or what it was, but I could feel the air in the room change, thick, heavy, oppressive. "Grandma," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, but she didn't respond. Maybe she hadn't heard me, or maybe she had but didn't want to acknowledge it. I slid off the couch, my bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. Every instinct in me was telling me to stay put, to wake up Grandma and let her handle whatever was happening, but something pulled me toward the hallway, an irrational curiosity I couldn't resist. As I stepped closer to the hallway, the noise became clearer. The whispers had transformed into muttering, strange and erratic. The shuffling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing, labored and strained. I peered around the corner, holding my breath, and that's when I saw her. A woman, tall and gaunt, leaning against the wall. She was completely naked, her pale skin stretched tight over her bones, her long, matted hair falling over her face, obscuring most of it. She was muttering to herself, words I couldn't understand, her body swaying slightly, as if she was barely able to stand. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to move or speak. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Who was she? How did she get into our house? My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I was sure she would hear it. I wanted to run, scream, do anything to break free from the paralyzing fear that had taken hold of me, but I couldn't. Then, as if sensing my presence, she stopped muttering. Her head snapped up, and through the tangle of hair, I saw her eyes, wild, bloodshot, and filled with an inexplicable rage. Her lips twisted into a snarl, and before I could react, she let out a piercing scream that echoed through the house, a sound so primal and terrifying that it shook me to my core. "Where is he? Where's Jeremy?" she shrieked, her voice hoarse and desperate. I didn't know who Jeremy was. I didn't know what she wanted. But in that moment, all I knew was that I had to get away. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to put distance between us. Her scream had jolted Grandma out of her chair, and before I could even register what was happening, she was standing in the hallway, between me and the woman. "Get out of my house!" Grandma shouted, her voice steady and commanding, though I could see the fear in her eyes. The woman didn't move at first. She just stood there, trembling, her eyes darting from me to Grandma, her hands clenched into fists. Then, suddenly, she lunged toward us, her bare feet slapping against the floor as she charged. Grandma reacted quicker than I could have imagined. She grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a broom leaning against the wall, and swung it at the woman with surprising force. The woman staggered back, letting out another guttural scream, but she didn't give up. She pounded her fists against the walls, against the door, still screaming for Jeremy. Grandma kept swinging the broom, backing the woman down the hallway until she finally reached the front door. "Get out!" Grandma yelled again, and this time, the woman listened. She threw the door open and disappeared into the night, leaving us standing there in the dim light of the living room, our hearts racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I didn't sleep at all that night. Neither did Grandma. We didn't speak about it, not then, not for a long time. But that night marked the beginning of something I would never forget. Something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined.